The session now is a journey about how we actually transformed an organization from where it was to where it is now in terms of legacy modernization, in terms of doing digital transformation. It's a journey about like how practically we approach certain problems and like got to the state that we are in today. Before we start the journey, this is a quick about me. I'm the group CTO of Knowledge. Knowledge is an organization. We are Platinum Lightbend partners, and then we work along with a lot of clients across the ecosystem, Fortune 500, to startups, and implement reactive solutions for them. We do architectural consulting. We do architectural audits. If you're building a system, we come in and like do an audit for you. The company is spread across 4 geographies. We are present in Toronto, we are present in Chicago, we are present in Singapore and India, and like 120 engineers. Of course, we are partners with Lightbend, Databricks, DataStax, and Confluent. So if you notice, like it's all the reactive ecosystem that we partner with, and that is the only thing that we do. So we try to do one thing, and we try to do it well. So that's a quick about me. Now, the agenda for the presentation today is the story about digital transformation for a huge cruising client. Like of course, Lightbend has a case study on that. You can like read about that. But it's a huge cruising client which was still held up in the cobwebs of AS400s and mainframes, and how like the transformation began. The story of transformation, the tools and techniques that we use, which actually ended up making us successful, and learnings along the way. So how many of you are actually like running an enterprise system which needs to be modernized, or like you are looking at a digital transformation journey? Great. Okay. Perfect. So hopefully like you'll gain something out of this. So what was the vision? Like the vision that the organization started with was the fact that they wanted to provide guests with an experience that leverages their previous experiences, like their previous cruising experiences, planning web history, and then drives relevant content to them based on their interests. So like the bigger goal is that, one, we need to modernize. We need to actually like build systems which are not held up in the past, but systems on which we can grow and innovate further. Second is a level of personalization which is required, because so far, at least for this organization, there was personalization non-existent. Like there was no personalization, there was no micro-segmentation, and everything and anything that was like pretty much rudimentary in terms of laying out like paper packages, or like sending out emails which were not very relevant to the clients. And then of course like increasing the revenues, not only pre-cruise, but on the cruise, as well as like beyond the cruise. So cruising, how many of you have been on a cruise? How many of you want to be on a cruise? All right. So cruising, by the nature, there is only 2% U.S. population that has been on a cruise. So it's a huge industry which enables itself to a lot of upswing. So that is what the company is trying to like target. That if eventually there are going to be more and more people who are getting into the cruising, business, or if there are people who are actually going to go on a cruise along with their families and friends, then that is a market that we want to capture. So what are the challenges? Just like you would imagine in any huge enterprise that has been successful all throughout, you have bulky systems. Like these are systems that are difficult to change. If these are systems which are tied up with mainframes, if these are systems which are tied up with a lot of legacy code, then they are bulky, difficult to change. There was a lot of static content which was getting generated. So like as I said, the flyers were being put on the ship. Like you were in your room, and you would get a flyer about the events for the upcoming day. So like not very digital. Then multilingual support. Like a lot of ships have got a lot of international travelers. Multilingual support is missing, and the entire experience is not characterized, or like not optimized for upsell. So unless and until we know the guest, like we know your preferences, we know what do you want to do and when do you want to do that, we cannot upsell. So and of course, not being on the latest and greatest, that was stifling innovation, and there was no way to really, like get to the market faster. And personalization, as I already said. So what was the idea here? The idea was that, okay, can we actually do something of course, in order to increase revenues, but also get a 360 view of the client or the guest that actually comes on the ship. Pre-cruise analysis, what do we do in terms of, like history and predictive modeling there? What do we do in terms of when you are actually booking, or at the time of pre-boarding, like when you're ready to get on a ship, how do we change the digital experience? Or when you're on the cruise, or once you are on the cruise and once you are off the cruise, ready for your next cruise, what are the things that we can do there? So, of course, like it sounds good. The idea was to follow the guest approach that, like wherever you are doing, whatever you are doing, we just want to make sure that we are completely following you. And it needs to be an omni-channel experience, so that like you are on your tablets, you are on your mobile, you are on your laptops, you are connected to the kiosk. Whatever you are doing, you are interacting with the like the shipboard systems. You should have an omni like channel experience. So all in all, a perfect case for digital transformation. However, when we talk about digital transformation, like a lot of organizations where we go in and we say that, oh yeah, like this is something that you should do. They talk about digital transformation, but they do not want to touch the legacy systems. Now, both these things cannot go hand in hand. Like you have to modernize your legacy systems. So one of the prerequisites for digital transformation is actually working with your legacy systems and actually modernizing them. So luckily, like we are in a stage where today, we have the Lightbend ecosystem. We have, like the CNC of the Cloud Native Cloud Foundation, Computing Foundation, which brings in a lot of ecosystem that allows us to modernize the existing legacy systems and take it to the next level. Some of the legacy systems would have to be rewritten, like some consolidation would have to be done and whatnot. But the genesis or the reason for doing legacy system remodernization is that the prime thing is that once you have done that, then the time to market really goes down a lot. If you want to innovate on a product, and like just imagine that throughout the day you would have heard about things like event sourcing, CQRS. Like if you have those kind of systems done, then if you want to add in a new functionality, replay the events and you have new functionality. So there is so much that can be done with the ecosystem that exists today. So we were clear on what needs to be done, and that what was that, okay, we need curation of the data. So we are collecting a lot of data right from when you're actually getting onto the internet, trying to book a cruise, to when you're, like getting your tickets done, to when you're actually boarding a cruise, and when you're on a cruise and whatnot. So there's a lot of data. So we need to curate that data, we need to do an analysis, and then we need to present recommendations to you. So for example, if we know that, hey, like you are a person who really loves to, dine out in the evening between 7 to 10 p.m., then maybe we have an offer for you. So a lot of promotions, a lot of real-time offers, they can actually be injected through machine learning models according to your, like history on the ship, or the way you are, interacting with the ship systems and whatnot. We knew what to do and we knew how to do it, which is, like, okay, we are going to build a system with reactive microservices. We have all the tool set that we need. So there, if we know that, like there are reactive ecosystems, Lightbend has Legom, and, like all the good stuff. So let us try, like building it. But the problem was that where do we start? Just like your enterprises, most of the enterprises have got systems which are just huge. Where do we start? What are the subdomains that we start looking at? What are the ones which are going to give us the maximum business value? Then, how do we start doing that? Why do we start with certain systems? So there are, of course, you'll see that there are a lot of questions that we had to answer before we said that, okay, let us pick up something that is going to make a huge business impact. So given all of that, let us get to the actual story of how we started doing it, and what are the pitfalls that we faced, and how did we actually manage to do what we did. So of course, there was a lot of pain and sweat, and things are not easy when we actually get started on them. So this is a monolith, right, which has been working for the last 20 years. This is like a car doing 100 miles, and we need to change the tires on that one. So guests are using it, the ships are cruising, the bookings are getting done, everything is working. How do we change that? We cannot stop it for, N number of months and say, okay, let us just, shut it down for 6 months and let us just modernize it. Not going to happen. So monolith currently in production, bringing in a lot of load and adding a lot of business value. Like the cruising companies adding ships by the year, like multiple more ships. So, and they are getting embedded with, like the monolithic system as well. Very little disruption from the business, of course. Like the business does not care. What they care about is that, hey, we really want to innovate faster. We want to bring better products to the market, but I do not want any of my existing systems to go down. So very little disruption, if at all expected. It was difficult, if not impossible, to make any changes to the underlying database and the models. And the approach that we follow should, like reduce the risk of evolution. So with all those things in mind, things suddenly start becoming very scary, because like, what is the first system that you're going to touch, which is not going to impact the business? Because that is, like always going to be difficult. So if you go by the book, like this is what the book says: identify the nouns, like do one thing well, and like there is a single responsibility principle. Perfect, but like does not work when you're actually talking about legacy transformation. What really works is something like this: that we identify the modules, we identify new and existing modules, which eventually can be changed, so which have got boundaries around themselves. Then we wrap them into service, saying that, okay, now this is a service, we expose API endpoints, and then we update the code for other blocks of code, like of other blocks of monolith to start using this new service. And then we rinse and repeat. So eventually, this is a model that is supposed to work. But now, again, like where do we start? If you look at the ecosystem, there is just everything under the sun that you can talk about here, right from like the transportation to the dining to marketing to like the payments to navigation to content. So drilling through all this, one of the realization that we had is that since it is going to be digital transformation, it is something that should make it visible to the guest on the ship to understand that, hey, like once I get on a ship, or like when I'm doing my booking, something has changed for me. So the idea was that if we are able to bring in a personalization or a set of content for the end user, which is called the guest in our ecosystem, the ubiquitous language, then like that is going to be a first business win. So we picked up the guest module, but again, like guest has got so many things under it that where do we really start, like biting off the monolith? So again, going by the book, we said, hey, let's do this. Like the guest has got various subdomains. Let us categorize those subdomains into the areas that we understand. And let us start, like biting them off one by one. So these are some of the subdomains that we came up with. And we said that, okay, like some of these are changing faster than the others, but that's okay. Like we'll pick up guest and we'll start with that. Okay, so let us start decomposing what we identified. Now, again, in theory, one of the things that you have to do is when you're starting with the decomposition is that you identify the subsystems. And again, these subsystems are identified with something called domain-driven design. Like I know the name rings a bell, but how many of us actually do it in practice, that's a different thing. But the domain-driven design gives us a very good idea of actually how to define our subsystems and the boundaries around that. So we identified some certain subsystems. So like this is a subset that, okay, we have loyalty, we have got self-service, we have identity. Let us start distributing them. The way of distribution is that all of these, when it is a monolith, it is all talking to the same database. So we try to identify boundaries and say that, okay, in this database, what are the tables or what are the like the sub-schemas, if you will, that loyalty is talking to, or identity is talking to. And then you separate out those pieces from the main database, and you put a API endpoint across identity, or like any subsystem that you are actually pulling out. And then you say that, okay, instead of other monoliths now talking to like the bigger monolith, which is this one, which is the guest service here, let them talk to identity for identity and like loyalty and promotions for everything else, whatnot. And so, yeah, like in theory, that's how it works, that you repeat and rinse. So, like you start plucking out systems one at a time, and you start identifying the tables, and you say that, hey, like this is how I'm going to put it. How many of you think that we succeeded with an approach like this? Nobody? Okay. No, this was the way. No, it wasn't. Okay, so this looks great, and we started doing that, and we spent, a couple of months doing this. So believe me, it was a hard time, and we failed, and it was, a shocker. We said, this is what the books talk about. This is how it needs to be done, and we are not able to segregate out the data that we have across, different subsystems. So this is what happened, rarely, so if you're working with monoliths, rarely, it is going to happen that your monolith is going to lend itself clearly and easily to nice and neat modularization. Normally, that does not happen, it's just tough. Relationships between the tables, they are highly normalized, and they exhibit a very tight coupling. So for you to say that, okay, I'm going to move out promotions, I'm going to move out loyalty, I'm going to change identity, it's easy in theory, but it looks great on the whiteboard. So that is how we started. But then once you get into the code, it is just difficult. And then understanding the monolithic code and the connecting wires, that's tough in itself. The monolithic systems, they have been prepared over 10 years, 20 years. And the people who build them, they are gone. The people who are maintaining them, they understand a part of it. So it's very difficult to understand, where to start and who has the knowledge about it. And then there are ugly migration steps, and at some time you reach a point of diminishing returns. So with this history behind us, then the next step was that, okay, we failed doing the way we wanted it to do. Now, how do we do it next? So, and then we started again. So we knew that, okay, the monolithic is tightly coupled. There is a high coordination which is required between teams. And, of course, we need to go through the CI/CD pipelines, and we cannot do a big bang, that's for sure. That is something that even the business would not allow, and we would not be able to do that. So how do we start eating the monolith in chunk size bytes and still be able to transform it? So again, restarting. So we have the guest account. The guest account is talking to the database that it needs to talk to. Any suggestions how we should have done it this time? All right, so what we did was that, so we just, went the easier route. We said, hey, there is a UI team which is just working separately. And let us just pull out the UI module. And so we pulled out the UI module. So the guest account still existed, minus the UI module now. So the UI is gone. We have got a separate UI team which was maintaining what they were maintaining, but it was said that, hey, now you can start working on some of the reactive pieces, can you do it on Angular, can you do it on React, and so on. So the UI was pulled out. So the entire module, and this is what we went to production with. They said, okay, yeah, just the UI is pulled out. We put API endpoints in front of guest account. That is our first step. So this was the crawl that we did. And with this, we were trying to validate various, scenarios. One, whether we can pull out a UI component out of, different modules. Second, is there a constant interaction which can happen between the teams, which are actually, pulling out these kind of modules. And third, if we are successful here, along with, putting it into production, then we would have already learned how do, these disparate modules, they work together, and we can take them to production. So step two was, okay, now UI is done. Let us try to see if we can introduce a new service, which is, again, going back to where we failed from, but it was a different process this time. So again, we tried to understand the bounded context. Second thing that we did was that we tried to understand that portion of the system which has got a high churn. So that is very important, because when you are actually picking out pieces out of a monolith, you have to pick out a system which has got a very high churn, which keeps constantly changing. Because what you do not want to do is that you do not want to keep adding functionality to the monolith as well. So for example, if there is, so for us, it was the promotions system, which, underwent a lot of changes with the games, with, the ecosystem, with, if there are new, sales that I want to do. So if we had not pulled out the promotion system, people would still be making changes in the monolith, and that is something that we want to avoid. Again, it is not something that you can totally get away with, but that's a way to go for us. the system is relatively disjoint from, like rest of the ecosystem, and then we started focusing on the events it emits and what are the events that it consumes. So that was for us to know that if we pull out this as a subsystem, what are the other, like pieces of the monolith that it is going to be interacting with, and what is the general interaction going to be? So how much network traffic are we actually talking about? And seed the database with the data from the monolith. And the last line is very important, that you should not have a dependency from the microservice that you're pulling out into the monolith. Because if you have that, then you just go down the wrong path. So we have the UI already pulled out. Then we pulled out promotions. Now, if you see, promotions has got a database of its own, which is being seeded with the database that we have from the guest account. So that is where the initial seeding gets done. And now this is how the system is pulled out. Step 3 was to see whether the system can survive the traffic that we are talking about. So step 3 was for us to start sending shadow traffic, real production shadow traffic, to the submodule. When we start sending, what does a shadow traffic mean? So the shadow traffic means that now there are actually 2 systems working in parallel. So the monolithic system is still there, and then we have got a pulled out promotion system, which is working according to what it needs to do. And the traffic which is coming in is getting sent across both the parts. The only difference being that, of course, we are not reading data out of the promotion system yet, because we want to validate that, okay, once it gets the traffic, it is actually behaving in the same way, or in a way that we want it to behave as compared to the monolith. So we send out shadow traffic to the system. Next step is to validate that, okay, in terms of what we had in the monolith versus what we have now in the subsystem, or the pulled out microservice, whether it is behaving the right way or not. So again, for us, we actually built our own internal tool for that called Liquidbase, which allows us to compare the data in motion across 2 systems, between the monolith and the microservice. And then you can flag out that, okay, this is not behaving the way it wants to. But once you have this validation done, then you can be kind of sure that okay, this is a system that I can take further. Step 4, we introduced something called a service mesh. So you could use Istio, or you could use Console. I'll talk about the tooling that we used. But the service mesh, what it does is that it allows you to control the flow of traffic. So either you could send out traffic to the monolith and the microservice, or you could say, hey, now I just want to send it to the microservice, or you could send it just to the monolith, and you can play around with that. So now, if you notice, the traffic is coming to the guest account as well as it is coming to promotions. We know that, okay, things are working fine. So again, this is the service mesh part where we actually, put in some the routing logic, and once we were satisfied, then we went ahead with that. And then, step 5 is to cut the cord, because now you do not need the data to be populated both in the monolith as well as the microservice, and you can cut the cord between the 2 to say that, okay, systems are working fine. I don't care, if the data is getting replicated or not. What do you do with the data which was already existing in the monolith? If you have compliance requirements like our client had, we just left it there. If there are, no compliance requirements, take your call on that. So we cut that cord, and then, the new service, we make sure that initially, there was a collaboration between the databases, but now we make sure that the monolith starts talking to the new service via the API of the microservice. So these are, the steps involved in getting from monolith to making sure that you are putting out a system, you're putting it into traffic, you're making sure that, the traffic is working fine, it is getting data populated, cutting the cord, and then finally making sure that the monolith now starts talking to the microservice and not vice versa. So for any promotions that we were running now, and again, all this goes into production, all the time. So it is like a continuous deployment. But the idea here is that whatever we are changing, whatever we are actually, implementing, it sees the light of the day immediately. So this went into production, and this is how the services were talking to each other. And then eventually, sorry if I go back, eventually this is a pattern that we continued following across the entire, the guest ecosystem. Any questions so far? Thoughts, suggestions? I know it's been a long day, but yeah.
You said you got to the point where the monolith queried the microservice and not the other way around.
Oh, that is correct. Yeah. So the question was that yes, we got to a point where the microservice queried the monolith queried the microservice, and not the other way around. Because if we have the other way around, going, then you'll always be making changes to the monolith. Saying that, okay, the microservice is still dependent on that. So if I need something, that I need to do something here. So we just wanted to make sure that the relationship is unidirectional from monolith to microservice and not the other way around. So it's more like, how do we actually, keep our packages independent, and saying that, okay, the directional flow is, outside and not inwards. So now the monolith starts talking to the microservice, and with every new microservice that we are pulling out, the monolith talks to, those, so that those are the microservices which are handling the functionality and not the other way around. And then any changes that need to be made for promotions or anything, they go back to that particular microservice. Okay, talking about the tools and techniques that we use, I know this is something which is dated, but believe me, this is something that really helped us a lot in working with legacy systems. Michael Feathers, he wrote this book, I believe, somewhere in 2000s. Some of you with gray hair like me might be able to remember that, But this is so relevant today when we are actually talking about digital transformation, when we are talking about legacy modernization, of how you actually start working along with legacy systems. So even for us, the first approach that we took was the fact that we built a very solid test harness around the legacy system, because without a test harness, you're done. You cannot go ahead, or it's just very difficult to go ahead. So we built a test harness. We used JUnit and Archillion for that in order to build a test harness. Once that was done, then we started extracting modules out. Another source of knowledge, very important when you're working with digital transformation, is going to be domain-driven design. So these are the two books, the Distilled and Implementing Domain-Driven Design. So we got a lot of inspiration from that as to how do we actually pull out subsystems from a monolith and actually start dividing it into smaller pieces. Another book which is a good inspiration is The Art of Scaling, in which it talks about how you can go in 3 dimensions of scaling, which talk about the X, Y, and Z axis, wherein how do you scale services by replicating them, how do you distribute them into microservices, and how do you actually shard the databases. So if you're using Cassandra or any other database that you are using, then this is a good book to get an idea about that. And of course, our entire ecosystem is built on the reactive principles. So when we actually undertake a digital transformation or do legacy modernization, the idea is that we are at all levels keeping in line with the principles of reactive ecosystem, which involve message-driven. So in our case, we were using a lot of Akka, we were using a lot of Legom, and then being elastic, being responsive in terms of scalability, being responsive in terms of failure. So a lot of those thankfully are handled by the Akka ecosystem, and Legom just lends us a hand on that. So that is where we embraced a lot of reactive principles. In terms of the tech stack, if you look at this is again a partial list. I'll come to a detailed one, but we are using Apigee, we are using Consul from HashiCorp on as a service mesh. Apigee being our API gateway. We are currently using Apache Camel for a lot of our third-party integrations, which we would be replacing to Alpaca as we go ahead. A lot of our heavy lifting in terms of microservices is being done in Legom. And we are heavily using the concepts of event sourcing and CQRS. So that gets done here. And then our API endpoints, since we are, so if you remember, like we had separated out the UI team early enough, so the API endpoints and the documentation for them is done through Epicurio and Swagger. Then, like we use Hoverfly for our testing. We use Kubernetes. Well, like we are going to use Kubernetes now for our deployments. So right now it has been DCOS with Mesos using Marathon, but eventually, like that is the way we will be going. So the stack is based on the Lightbend stack, as you would notice. A lot of use of Legom and the underlying technologies there. This is how like the entire ecosystem looks like. Different pieces interacting with each other, but like this is the landscape in terms of the tech stacks. So you'll see like a lot of. So if I talk about some of the key components which have made this journey easier, of course like it is Legom. I don't know how many of you have played with Legom, but like it's we have just found it to be a wonderful tool. Of course, like it has got a few quirks here and there because it is new and the way it interacts with other systems, but like it's still benefits outweigh the disadvantages at the moment. So it is opinionated. It is a framework that comes along with guardrails to say that, hey, if you are like moving in this direction, then okay, I have you covered. So with respect to event sourcing, CQRS, that helped us a lot. Built on top of Akka & Play, it helps build systems with the reactive principles. And it has got out-of-the-box support for some of the things that otherwise we would be building, like things like circuit breaker, like things like event sourcing CQRS, they are just kind of taken care of. We use Consul. In a way, we are kind of fortunate to be working with like some architects who are on the board of Cloud Native Computing Foundation. So some of the products like Kubernetes, Prometheus, they are actually graduating from that ecosystem. Consul is getting graduated from HashiCorp, but like closely related. So this is something that we use as a service mesh for our service discovery, and then we put in our rules for traffic flow and whatnot. Spark, as you would imagine, for all our compute jobs where we are actually doing computations on what does the guest do, what has been his history, what could be the next step. So we use a lot of Spark for data processing, mostly doing batch processing right now because like we do not have enough streaming happening. So it's a lot of batch processing. Then the deployments are mostly on DCOS. DCOS allows you to see your entire cluster as a single operating system, and like you can deploy. So we make fun about it, saying that it is the app store for enterprises. Of course, with Kubernetes, it has been losing some of the sheen, I would say, but still, pretty good in terms of what it does. And our idea is to now, deploy Kubernetes on DCOS and take it from there. Kafka, as you would expect, we are doing a lot of Kafka in terms of microservice, like interactions. And PubSub. And one of the biggest thing is that the ships and the shore, as we call it. So the shore has got data centers which are at rest. All the ships have got data centers which are in motion. So that brings in a separate level of challenge wherein how do you synchronize between the two. I'm just going to go a little faster now. I got a prompt for 5 minutes. Then we are using something called LaunchDarkly, which helps us launch our new functionality as canary releases, or as rolling releases, or as split traffic, whatever we want to do with that. But the idea here is that if you want to release a functionality to a particular ship or a particular geography, then you can just do that with LaunchDarkly. Or if you want to make sure that your microservices are working without really exposing them, you can do that. So this allows the business actually to release the functionality in a controlled manner. Then these are the usual tools, so Jenkins, Epicurio, Hoverfly, Kubernetes, Cassandra. As the day stands today, we are mostly after the dark. The guest ecosystem is out in production. It has been deployed on so this is how it looks like. I'm sure you are able to read that, but so this is all the microservices interacting with each other and on DCOS. The journey ahead is that, right from discover to booking to commerce to check-in to, embarkation, blah, blah. And finally, so, it's a complete 360 about the guest experience on the ship as we go ahead. So 60% of the ships, they are actually, using the ecosystem now. So data centers are being kept in sync along with Kafka Connect. This is, what the initial numbers are looking like. So 89% of the customers or the guests who had done a cruise previously, they say that, this is much, much better as compared to what we had earlier. Business has got a lot of satisfaction because they are able to innovate and release new functionality. Event sourcing really allows us to, handle that. If you want to release a new functionality, with 2 months prior data, we are able to do that. So if I quickly go with the key learnings, being monolithic is not bad. That is how most of the big products have started. Netflix, Amazon, eBay, all of them, started monolithic. The idea is that once you decide that you have to actually change it, then one of the key things is going to be domain-driven design. It is going to be reactive architecture principles. And again, I kind of place enough emphasis on them. But if you try to do legacy modernization before understanding, domain-driven design, some of the, legacy ecosystem things, it's bound not to go very well. Focusing on base instead of ACID. So base, what it says is that we want to be in an eventually consistent mode, and that is the most scalable mode. If you look at the most of the products today, they do not follow ACID. They cannot be web scale products. Then compensating patterns like sagas. If things go wrong, how do you actually take care of that? Stop adding new functionality to the monolith. The easiest and low-risk option is to separate out the front end and back end, and that is how we are doing it across the ecosystem now for Royal, the client. And keep the communication between the microservices asynchronous and non-blocking. So these are some of the reactive principles. Deploy with containers, work with feature flags and dark launches, and monitoring and operations need to be built into your pipeline. One of the most important things at an organization level is that we have to start building service teams which take care of certain pieces of functionality, and that is again analogous to domain-driven design and how we'll be working with that. It includes creating multidisciplinary units and embracing code. So rules of software craftsmanship, some of the rules that we have studied about legacy core, domain-driven design. So all of those are applicable when you're actually getting into a digital transformation journey. And believe me, the businesses, they do not care whether we use the latest and greatest technology. They are interested in business value. And in order to provide business value, this is what is required. So these are some of the interesting links. You can find more details about this on our blogs. There is a case study that we have done, and Nautilus has a Nautilus digital platform that now we go ahead and bring to fruition so that we can accelerate digital transformation for a lot of our enterprises. And that's about me, and I'll be happy to answer. Do we have time for any question? But yeah, catch me around. We have a booth over at the fourth level, and we'll be happy to shake hands and chat and discuss more about the case study or any questions that you might have. Thank you so much.